I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jensen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Amy Fong is Vice President in Everest Group's Sourcing and Vendor Management Practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value for strategic provider relationships in outsourced services categories. Banushi Malhotra, Senior Analyst, works with sourcing and vendor management leaders on collaborative research and advisory engagements to help them extract the maximum value for their procurement activities. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Michael.
Hello, everybody. I'm dialing in or beaming in from the just north of Dallas. We just had a little bit of an ice storm here, and we're preparing ourselves for us to go full Chicago on us. I think in the next couple of days, we're going to get an incredible cold snap here. Going to be the coldest in the last 3 decades, actually. So, but we have a hot topic here. And so what I wanted to do was to introduce the discussion points for today, and then Amy's going to talk a little bit about defining it. So today is really the kind of showcasing the results from our last Pinnacle study. And Pinnacle studies are designed to show the cause and effect relationship between what companies are performing the best and how they're doing it. And so with that, we'll talk a little bit about this study. We'll show you what good looks like, and then how companies are getting there. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Amy, why don't you just talk a little bit about why this is, how we define it and why this is an important topic?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. And welcome, everyone. Happy to be here today. So if we look at what supplier management encompasses, and many people will call this supplier relationship management, it's really a framework of how we manage our suppliers. And on the left here, we've got, can we hit the next slide? I think I might have lag. Thank you. A little bit of a lag there. On the left here, we have a typical supplier relationship management framework. So there's several different aspects of supplier relationship management. There's the governance model, kind of deciding stratification to decide where you're going to spend your time, innovation, risk management, the technology that enables all of this, and one of the core activities of performance management. We wanted to look at these aspects across the supply base, but we wanted to look specifically at the top of the pyramid, the most strategic suppliers. I've been looking at SRM for probably 15 years now, or maybe 20 if I count my time in industry doing SRM activities. And there's a lot of different ways to manage suppliers, but there's some common themes throughout. What we were interested in is for those most strategic suppliers, often whom are big service providers on the services side these days. If you're outsourcing your IT services, you know, those are significant deals that have a big business impact, or outsourcing a piece of the business. There's other strategic suppliers in different categories as well. So the research we're going to talk about today really focuses specifically on strategic suppliers. And I think we can learn a lot about what organizations are doing and how those that do it well, what they look at, what they measure, how they execute. So excited to have everybody here today to cover this.
Okay, we said this was a Pinnacle study. And for us, the goal of a Pinnacle study is to identify those enterprises that perform better than others in the industry. So this is not a market comparison. There is no suppliers involved in this. There's no technology involved in this. This is looking at capability. And the way we do that is along the bottom axis, the x-axis, you'll see the capability maturity. Those are 5 different dimensions we measure, and there's several questions we ask around that. And then on the y-axis, we have the outcomes, which are the impact areas to the overall business. And what you see in what we call the dot plot chart here is the performance of every single participant in the study. And what you do is you'll see that there's generally a line that goes from the lower left to the upper right. And that's really that cause and effect relationship that I was illustrating earlier, that we want to understand what enterprises are doing and what do they get as an outcome for that. And then we'll compare the entire database to those in the upper right, which are those that we've highlighted in green. Those are the ones that have performed best on both outcomes and capabilities. One quick note here, you won't see anything in the upper left. So that what that shows us from a diagnostic standpoint is that if you don't have the capabilities, you don't get the outcomes, and you don't see any dots in the lower right. So if you have capabilities and you put them in place, you're more than likely going to have impact from them. So that's a good, from a research guy's perspective, that capability of an outcome shows cause and effect. So that's what you're going to be looking for. As we look at the outline for the rest of the session today, we're going to go through the various aspects of the outcomes of the Pinnacle model first. And with that, Amy, why don't you just talk about the general format, and then let's drill down on each.
Yeah, let's start talking about what good looks like. And that for us is the outcomes on that y-axis of the Pinnacle chart. Always like it when we see a nice diagonal line through capabilities and outcomes. We look at 3 types of outcomes when we do our Pinnacle models: the cost impact, operational impact, and business impact. You can think of the cost as spend cost reduction, probably one of the most common things that we're looking at as procurement experts and professionals, and operational impact being more of the operational improvements you get through effectively managing your strategic suppliers. And then business impact, and these are more qualitative often, but they're really important. Things like business agility and innovation, all things that were especially important over the last year or so. So let's jump into these. I'll walk through each of these 3 areas and some of the data. You're going to see a lot of charts, and you will get the slides. Everyone asks that, so don't feel like you need to jot all this down or take screenshots. But the gist of it is that when we represent our Pinnacle enterprises, they're the green bar, and the blue is the other enterprises. So that top green, or that top right corner on that chart that Michael showed, is represented by these green bars. So the first thing that we looked at was, for the Pinnacle organizations, what are some of the financial benefits that strategic suppliers were generating? And the difference here between green and blue, you can see, is pretty drastic. The Pinnacle enterprises told us that they were getting more discounts, flat fees, customization of services, reduced upfront costs, value add services, transformational savings, significant difference there. Pretty much all the things that you want to be negotiating, even price volatility mitigation, which is a pretty tricky thing to get into a contract, and revenue improvement. So the difference here, 1.73 difference in terms of the benefits coming out of their strategic suppliers from other enterprises. What that tells us is they are doing something to get more value from that top of the pyramid supply base. The next thing we looked at in terms of operational benefits is how Pinnacles are channeling spend through suppliers that they consider strategic. And this is important because as we look, you hear a lot about narrowing the long tail or shortening the long tail of the supply base. One of the ways that you do that is by channeling spend through the suppliers that are trusted partners, that are, that have earned the business, and kind of cutting off that tail where you can. I can go on for hours about tail spend and the need to keep some of it, but certainly the more consolidated you are at your strategic suppliers, the better. And again, this was an area where we see a really drastic difference. You'll notice that the net numbers are very different for direct and indirect. So when we look at something like direct, you may have a lot of different suppliers, and 35% is pretty good consolidation. It means you're getting multiple parts from, your most strategic partners. On the indirect side, though, there's a pretty broad range here. And with things like IT and telecom and professional services, the Pinnacles were hitting over 50% of their spend in those areas from their strategic suppliers. That implies that they've got a great deal of control in their, as we'll see in some of the capabilities, getting ahead of the specifications and the negotiation and the selection process to really drive those activities with their partners.
Yeah, Amy, when I look at this, that IT difference, IT telecom difference really is remarkable. You look further down the list, you see a little bit of difference like in facilities, but that IT telecom, really, really impactful for those Pinnacle enterprises.
Yeah. And you could argue that IT could be, especially in the services side or really in any part, could be fairly fragmented. I mean, we talk to companies all the time that have 30 or 40 different IT service providers, right? But the ones that are doing it right are trying to get that down to 3 or 4, or maybe even 1 or 2, right? So we'll have another study actually coming up on portfolio consolidation, and that kind of ties into this. How do we get down and make the decision of what's the right number of providers in some of these more strategic, high value categories. So if we jump to the next thing that we looked at in terms of the strategic value or the business value, we asked about a variety of different types of benefits that we can get from strategic suppliers, and you can see the data for the Pinnacle enterprises here. I will say that a lot of these benefits are difficult to get and difficult to measure, but you see some real differences. The significant level of benefits received were in areas like collaboration and risk management and stakeholder experience. Stakeholder experience and is customer satisfaction is top of mind this year. Even pre-COVID, that was top of mind in early 2020 and continues to be higher and higher priority. So when you have suppliers that are helping to drive stakeholder experience, that's very valuable. All of these are really things that every procurement team should be striving for with their to deliver to their stakeholders.
Yeah, I see that stakeholder experience, a customer experience. That's really tying directly to what we've seen from our clients telling to us on the business objectives they're trying to achieve. So as we changed business models in the pandemic and we had to shift a lot of things around, getting good alignment with your strategic suppliers, incredibly important.
Definitely. And you see that in the risk side as well.
Yeah.
So the last outcome that I want to touch on, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into supplier innovation, because driving innovation from the supply base is often a stated goal of these programs, any kind of SRM or supplier management, supplier development program. And what we saw is that while innovation can be really challenging to measure, respondents, especially Pinnacles, we're able to attribute a significant improvement in supplier innovation or in innovation to their suppliers. So if we look at the benefits that they attributed to supplier innovation, Pinnacles saw more cost reduction, obviously very important in this economic cycle, operational efficiency, reduction of headcount, as well as working capital management. And that's incredibly important. I see a question of, is continuous cost improvement part of this as well? And yes, it is. I think when we look at something like operational cost efficiency or process efficiency and cost reduction, those are the types of benefits that many companies are looking to drive. It's not the only thing, but certainly coming up with innovative ideas to improve the process and take out costs is very important.
Okay, so let's go from the outcomes to the capabilities. This is really where you get into the how part of the conversation. And what we're going to do here is Banushi is going to talk to us about these 6 different dimensions here that we measured.
Thanks, Michael. So there are really 6 aspects which are going into supplier relationship management, and the whole concept starts with first classifying your suppliers, right? So supply-based stratification, you're looking at the whole maturity. We're looking at the maturity of supply-based stratification as to what are the factors that organizations are measuring for it, how often they're measuring it, and how many factors they're measuring. The second aspect that goes into it is governance. And herein, we looked at the whole role of different functions in an organization. So from procurement to VMOs, and then the business or the functional aspect. Where exactly are they coming into the supplier management activities? Are they playing a more executive role? Are they playing a steering committee role? Or are they just doing day-to-day operational tasks? The third aspect, and I know that this is an interesting one for a lot of people, technology. So what are the types of technologies that are used in supply management activities, whether it's basic technologies like basic analytics, or even advanced technologies such as RPA. The fourth one is performance management. So here we've measured 2 aspects really. So first is the whole measurement part of it. What are the methodologies that are going into performance measurement, and how often are Pinnacle or other enterprises measuring their strategic suppliers' performance? And then the second aspect is what are the strategies that they're following for supplier improvement, because that is also an important step. You want to give the supplier an incentive to move to the next step as well. The next aspect is risk management. So over here as well, we are measuring the the ways that risk is measured in general, how often it is measured, as well as evaluating supply continuity strategies. The last one, which is, I would say it's a relatively more mature aspect, like one of the most mature aspects of SRM, supplier relationship management, just the whole approaches that Pinnacles are or other enterprises are taking to improve outcomes through supplier innovation. So in fact, this will have really interesting results as well to show, because there's a huge gap between Pinnacles and others.
Okay, so let's before we get into the actual line by line results, let's get a little bit of input from the live audience here. And since we like to do these webinars live, the question we're going to ask is, what factors do you consider when you stratify your supply base? So that was the first dimension that Banushi mentioned. Go ahead and select all that apply. And I'm not going to read the list to you, but pick those that you're using to stratify your supply base. Okay, answers are coming in pretty quickly.
This is always interesting for me to see.
Yeah, Amy, we'll let you provide other commentary as you see it here. Definitely see a leader now. See two leaders out there that just sticking. The good news is the one that's not getting any answers is we do not stratify our supply base. That's only, well, there's two people that have said that. Okay, fantastic. We got a huge number of votes right now, so we're way past statistical significance. We're now into the into the three figures. So, all right, great. Let's go ahead and close that. And so the strategic alignment with supplier alignment with strategic needs stood out, along with total supplier spend. So supply cubes, spend cubes are certainly in play, but let's talk about that one that stood out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to say, let's jump to the next slide and talk about that, because we have the data from the study. It's pretty similar, I would say, for Pinnacles. We've got a lot of high-performing companies on the line today, I would guess, which is great. So spend is something that we've always seen. You know, of course, analyzing your spend and understanding who your biggest spend is with is incredibly important, and that's kind of the fundamental, the first filter you want to take. What I've seen in the past, and this is pretty consistent, but Pinnacles have done this more and more and showed really in our data, it showed in that poll, is looking at other factors besides just spend. Alignment with strategic needs obviously has stood out. And that's really not looking at past spend, but looking at what is our future profile expected to look like. You know, if we expect to be expanding into a new region, which of our providers, our strategic suppliers, can really support us there, and where are we aligned on roadmaps? You know, things like that are fairly qualitative. You may not have a chart of data, but you know that certain suppliers are going to be more supportive or be better aligned in their roadmap. Risk impact is another one, and business revenue impact. Those two, to me, are about what is the impact of something going wrong. I've got some really sad stories of product delays due to a $2 part being delayed. That was a revenue impact, and it's easy to overlook those things because you think this is a small supplier, but they're critical to your success. And I think tenure with the organization is an interesting one. Supplier relationship, that's another one that's a little bit warm and squishy, but can be very important when we're talking about who do we want to partner with for our next next endeavor, or to improve this process. If it's a service, who do we trust to really bring the value? And more we're relying on partners. We don't have the level of vertical integration that we did 40, 50 years ago. So interesting data. And I think this kind of backs up some of the data. The other piece on this slide is just the frequency of supplier stratification. We did see that Pinnacles were more likely to reevaluate more often, at least annually, or more, or when events triggered it. So, you might have gone back in last summer and said, well, where are we with our supply base now? Who do we need to align with given the changes in the environment?
So Amy, I was comparing the results of this slide and from your study results and the quick poll. that we just did, and the top 4 answers are exactly the same answers.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting the way.
So the live audience got it right.
Hopefully they're doing that in practice too, right? Quick polls are easy. It's putting in motion that's hard. Let me turn it over to Banushi to go through the next area of capabilities, supply-based governance.
Great. So when we talk about governance, basically the first thing that we look at is what are the supplier relationship management teams or just the systems in place to manage activities. So when we looked at the data, I mean, there's a huge gap here, in fact. So if you look at dedicated supplier relationship team or even the IT VMO, which are the teams that are actually managing supply management activities, more number of Pinnacles are having these type of teams than other enterprises. In fact, for an IT VMO, again, this goes back to our discussion on IT, right? Because IT is one of the categories that has a lot of service providers. So they probably need more of a VMO in place to manage supply management activities. But some of the results or just the conversations we had from the survey participants was based around the fact that VMOs are not just present in IT, they're also sometimes present in other categories such as BPO. Some participants said that they have a VMO for all categories. And some of them said that there is a VMO within each line of business, and that rolls up to a centralized VMO. So really interesting 3 or 4 responses that we got on the VMO aspect as to how it's really placed in an organization. So the next step that we looked at was the roles and responsibilities of a procurement VMO and business when it comes to supply management activities. So this was pretty much in line with what you would expect, right? Procurement is more involved in the sourcing aspect. So RFPs and benchmarking, that is where procurement plays a primary role. And the VMO plays more of a supporting role in these sourcing type of activities, and they play more of a primary role in day-to-day operational activities. Whereas business is playing a primary role in things like, just gathering requirements together, as well as budget tracking, defining SLAs, and this is what it should be, right? Like in place as well. So in order to drive like maximum value from your supply management activities, it's also important to define the roles that each function is playing. The last aspect that we looked at in the governance criteria was around, if we can move to the next slide, it was around the events that procurement teams used to measure their individual team members on. So this is an interesting graphic because you can see on the bottom half, we've placed more of the activity-based measurements, which talks about the number of events that are happening. So for instance, how many supplier events are held, or how many supplier reviews have been completed by that individual team member. Whereas when you move to the top, we're measuring more of results-based aspects. So what is the overall stakeholder satisfaction with the supply base? Or what are the revenue or operational cost improvements that are driven by supplier innovation? So Pinnacles, of course, are really leading the way over here consistently across activity as well as results-based measurements. They're performing significantly higher. So it's interesting to see how they're much more likely to measure their team members on both like number of events as well as results. So yeah.
Thanks, Banushi. Thanks. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about the technology. That last one, I know that one about the VMOs and the measurement, those are pretty big slides. We will give out the slides after. So again, you'll have a chance to look through these, but there's a lot of really interesting information. We get questions a lot about, what should our VMO do and what should our procurement team do? And I mean, the answer is they should collaborate and work hand in glove, right? But thinking about who's primary and who's secondary is really an approach that I found pretty successful. So let's talk about the technology. I am going to preface this by saying I'm going to go through this a little quickly because we have a virtual roundtable next month that's specifically on technology related to supplier management. So I want to invite everyone to attend that. The invites will be going out soon. So if you're on this webinar, look for that invite for virtual roundtable, in a couple months or in a week or so. But I think that this is a topic where technology to handle supplier management, or what we often call supplier lifecycle management, is one of the least developed segments in the source to pay technology stack. So I was really interested to see what the adoption levels were on these very specific activities around sourcing execution, around supplier information management, supply-based strategy, risk management. When you look at the numbers on adoption here, they're very low. We are at, below 40%, I think, for in place, and then a lot of, some people implementing. So give that credit. You still don't really break 50% on any of these. That means that what you see in tools, a lot of times it's things like spreadsheets. They're not really listed here. We didn't actually count, if you're using Excel. Or, there are some Power BI you see on here, Tableau, dashboards from BI type tools for things like stakeholder dashboards, which is a good solution. But when you get to things around supplier performance management, there's really a mix here. Some of you may have seen a quick poll we did looking at whether people are using those more generic enterprise tools like spreadsheets or BI tools versus more procurement specific tools. And the majority were not using procurement specific tools. So that really shows up. And of course you have the suites versus the best of breed type tools in here as well. This is not an exhaustive list. There's hundreds of different solutions that can do all of these different components. I think the message here is that they're not heavily implemented. They're not common these days yet. And B, there's just so many to choose from that you're not likely to find one that's good at every single one of these activities. So this is where we really see the use of best of breed tools start to stand out. And if we look at the next slide.
Hey, Amy, before we go to the next slide,
go ahead.
I was really, you and I have been talking about this technology adoption for the last couple of years here. And that was the first thing I said is, there's nobody breaking 50 on these line items.
He hates how many logos there are here.
Yeah, and there's how many logos and how many solutions. Why do you think that's not, why we're getting this low adoption? Is the technology is not good enough? Is it procurement organizations aren't, don't want to invest? Is it why do you think it is?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of reasons. Again, that's kind of why we're having this virtual roundtable to talk more about this in a more interactive forum. But I would say the first one is that if you were to decide what to automate and digitize in your procurement stack, this is one of the last things. You're going to start with the transactional in most cases, and you're going to get to things like, risk management and performance management probably last. So there's a lag there. The tools, when you look at some of the source to pay suites, they're less developed in this segment, in my opinion. So, you may try to get what you can, or just do what you can in a enterprise tool like a Power BI or Tableau, or in spreadsheets, without really investing the effort to get the system you have to do this well. And there's another aspect that these are just hard things to automate. Supplier relationship management has the word relationship in it for a reason. So there's that, even when you look at the stratification, those are some things that aren't automatically digital capable, right? Or not in an easy way.
I looked at the next slide. I already looked ahead a little bit, and I've seen these results, and but we do see it as a gigantic differentiator between the Pinnacles and the rest of the enterprises, those that can implement these. And so
so the next, if we jump to the next slide, I think that sort of takes it to the next level. The question that we often get, I get a lot, is whether we should have core source to pay tools, or whether we should get best of breed tools for certain activities. And this was really interesting when we did that quick poll, and we looked at, that most people have kind of generic tools versus a specialized procurement tool for these activities. Somebody internally, good, smart thinking analyst said, well, are they happy with their spreadsheets? Because if you're happy with Excel, that's not a bad thing. And I'm like, you're right. There's nothing inherently wrong with using a generic, enterprise tool. In fact, we would do that if the ERP did this well, we'd all be doing it through our ERPs, right? But what I loved when I saw this data was that it really kind of proves out that the Pinnacles, those with the best results, actually tend to be using, they have, targeted procurement specific tools more likely. And they probably are also using an ERP, but they also have more best of breed tools for things like risk, governance of suppliers, complex services management, specifically complex services management. You know, some of the ones on the last page, I think Syrian Labs was there, and there's a couple of others that are designed really strongly for services. They're using those tools. Performance management, lifecycle management, not part of a suite tools. You know, you see a pretty big difference here where these tools do seem to correlate well with higher performance, and that's pretty interesting.
I know you and I get the question of, you know, is it best of breed or core, which is going to win? I have a strong preference here that ultimately, you know, you end up the core source to pay tools actually become more robust over time and deal with the issue of fragmentation and integration and all the things you have. You got a million different logos here, but for now it looks like we've got to deal with both models are viable, but over the long term I think you follow the money and follow the capability.
Yeah. I mean, we see a lot of acquisition behavior in the market. You know, there's plenty of places you can find that, partners of ours, and we also see some of these tools really maturing and building the capabilities. I've seen companies do these things really well with a tool like you know, a Power BI type tool. Those tend to be companies that have extremely high level resources internally to build that kind of tool, right? So when Microsoft shows me how well, and I love Microsoft, like how well they do things with Power BI, I'm like, that's great, but most companies I work with don't have the resources to do that, right? So you really have to think about what you're going to be able to build if you're using something generic.
Well, that and sourcing and procurement doesn't necessarily get to go ahead of in the enterprise requirements or stack of priorities. Procurement and sourcing may not make to the top.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I've seen some, this is just another kind of hint or tip, I guess. What I've seen some successful companies do is really procurement making an effort to borrow those resources from other functions. You know, go to your enterprise analytics COE and get people to come in and help you, right? Partner them as part of your team to build these kind of tools or to customize. That has a higher chance of success than just trying to, you know, pick a database and make it work. I did this 20 some years ago on spreadsheets, by the way. So I have no, you know, I get it that it works, and that was for a Fortune 10 company. So it does work, but there's better ways in 2021. So let's jump to, I think we're going to jump to performance management now.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about performance management, we really looked at two aspects of it. So firstly, we looked at the measurement part, and then we looked at the improvement part, which we'll get to in a moment. But just looking at how, you know, often strategic suppliers are being measured in Pinnacle enterprises. Of course, Pinnacles are evaluating their performance more often than the other enterprises, which is every 6 months versus every 8 months. But even the percentage of strategic suppliers that are falling into the evaluation criteria, that is also higher in Pinnacles as compared to others. So we see that 85% of strategic suppliers are being measured as compared to 69. And all Pinnacle enterprises, in fact, are evaluating the strategic supplier performance, at least on a periodic basis, at least annually. So that really says something. So the next aspect that we measured was around improvement as to what are the activities. If we can move to the next slide, we'll see that there are various activities that if we see the chart on the right, we see that there were a lot of activities that are used to improve supplier performance by Pinnacle enterprises. So some of these are more basic, which is talking about, you know, monitoring your performance and just taking corrective actions when you find out that there's a performance glitch, which is more of a reactive kind of a measure. But some of them are more proactive as well, like you're adopting, you know, design thinking, or you're even providing monetary incentives to your suppliers, which I think is a really, it's a very great thing to do, because if you're incentivizing your supplier in a monetary way as well, then you're really, really motivating them to drive transformational changes, because these things are not free for the suppliers as well. So, and if we look at the chart on the left side, we can see that Pinnacles are using a large number of tools just to measure their customer satisfaction. So it's a good mix of, you know, surveys and interviews and customer effort score and all, whereas they're measuring, at least they're measuring customer satisfaction for all of their service strategic suppliers as compared to others.
Thanks, Benushi. I think that that mix of stakeholder satisfaction management or measurement is really interesting. The next area that I want to touch on is risk management. And again, risk management, used to be sort of a whole discipline on its own. It is a whole discipline on its own, but really what I've seen over the last 5 years is we tend to kind of spit it in with supplier management. So SRM programs and risk are kind of overlapping now, although I will caveat this by saying, you don't only want to look at your stratification for risk management is probably not the same stratification only for other supplier management activities. They're matrixed, they're meshed together, but they're not, the same list. You've got other factors in lower tiers of suppliers that you probably should be tracking risk on as well. And there's a lot of complexity in that. But I think one thing that we looked at was, the frequency of risk assessments. And we did find that most organizations are doing, or a lot of organizations are doing it at the time of onboarding. I'm a believer that you should be checking risk and suppliers when you onboard them quarterly, and then when there's a trigger. And I think the numbers are a little low here in terms of who's actually doing risk assessments. So, totaled it up, most people are probably doing them at one point. But when, few are doing really the combination that we would consider best practice. If you are checking a risk profile of your suppliers every year, every 2 years in 2020, 2021, it's pretty easy to miss things. And you may have categories of suppliers that you put a less, lighter touch monitoring, but you're probably not uncovering a lot of things that may be changing their profile.
We certainly had a lot of trigger-induced reviews this past year.
Yeah. I mean, did everyone not do a trigger-induced review last year? This data, the numbers, actually, the magnitude of the numbers surprised me a little bit. I've seen other, polls we've done with higher numbers, but I think the essence is that, at least quarterly should be your regular cadence, and there's a little bit more on the Pinnacle side for that.
One of our most popular topics that you and I had this year were to review the suppliers, the outsourcing suppliers themselves.
Yeah, which, by the way, that's a pretty stable group. Although they might be your most strategic suppliers or in that top tier, it's not a category where there's a lot of risk, but there's plenty of other categories on your spend portfolio that do have risk. So figuring out where those are is really half the battle. And then you got to mitigate those plans, right? I think the other piece on here on the right, this was a bit of a differentiator between Pinnacles, was the percent of their strategic suppliers that were covered with risk mitigation plans. So not just measuring the risk, but actually putting a plan in place to address it if something were to happen or to minimize the risk. And 82% of their strategic suppliers had some kind of risk mitigation plan, which is pretty high number. I think procurement teams have gotten better over the years at building those mitigation plans, coming up with a backup, having a strategy to diffuse the risk. The next question that around risk, or the last one around risk that I thought was particularly timely is around supply continuity. So what are we doing to ensure continuity for our most strategic suppliers? The difference here jumps out right away, right? The Pinnacles are doing a lot more of these things. Obviously, most companies are doing more than one. You can just tell that by the numbers. Having contractual clauses or controls is great. Continuously monitoring is important, but having a process to actually shift product and service segments around and ensuring backup suppliers, that's harder than just putting the terms in a contract, right? You got to really have backup suppliers that are ready to go. And the high insurance and liabilities and controls, that's more of a contractual thing that you can do. I would say that's a little difficult when you're looking, that can be a barrier, at least when you're trying to increase your use of diverse suppliers. Small businesses, may not have the same insurance liabilities. So helping to back that up, I've seen some companies do that. And identifying backup suppliers as well. We saw a lot of rearranging, or we are seeing a lot of rearranging of the service provider portfolio this year. And I think some of it comes down to this, continuity plans for various reasons, not just for financial stability, but to meet the needs of the future and be able to shift work around as needed.
Yeah. I think an interesting one on this slide is also that, while Pinnacles are also identifying their suppliers more, but there are processes in place for the contingency plan itself, that if the backup supplier has been identified, there's an entire really quick turnaround process to shift the operations to a backup supplier immediately. Even I've heard of instances in which in one weekend, they've just been shifting their entire strategic suppliers to another supplier just because there was some trigger-induced risk that came up. So just some COVID-induced instances, but interesting to note.
That's a great point. I see someone saying they're seeing their clients monitoring health of suppliers to track their health and their ability to respond to unforeseen circumstances. That's, I think, a supplier who's seeing that, and they should be, right. And health isn't just financial health. There's a lot of other things, and you see that we have a risk report on the top 25 service providers quarterly, where we're looking at things like reputational governance risk. Financial is in there. Has the leadership changed, right? Do you have a new CEO who's changing the strategy? And that's all very important. And congratulations, they're passing with flying colors. So that's great to see too. Thanks for sharing that in the chat. Let me turn it back to Banushi, who's going to hit on the last of the capability areas of innovation.
So this, again, it's an interesting one because it's a relatively more mature area, and the gap between Pinnacles and others across all parameters is just so high. So it was a very interesting data result that we got. If we look at the whole aspect of innovation and how innovation is encouraged from strategic suppliers in organizations, there are really three things that are tying together over here. So the first is that innovation is included as a component in the contracts as well. That is very crucial because, again, as I said, like nothing is free. So if your suppliers are doing something for you, then it should be something that they should be incentivized for. Then you're also having a steering mechanism in place that is governing the supplier while it is doing that. And then there are regular reviews of the same. So there are, first you're introducing a component of it, and then you're regularly reviewing it, and you have a committee that is managing the whole governance of it. And of course, there are some other aspects as well, like you're having periodic organized innovation days, which is again an interesting one because I think these were supplier innovation summits and things like that, which are 1 day or 2 day events which are happening that are really productive for just idea sharing and execution after that as well. So huge gap between Pinnacle and other enterprises here, and
Yeah. So Banushi, when I look at this thing, I mean, I don't think there was any other dimension that had this big a delta between the two, between the Pinnacles.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I go back in the outsourcing category, and that's part of what I've been in for the past 3 decades. And this has been a perpetual issue. And you said something about, you do have to pay for it. And I think that's what they get enamored with. Hey, well, we're going to negotiate a contract, and it may be for a longer term relationship. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, but then they stop moving the needle forward. And I think that's where you get into trouble, is if you don't either build it in or you don't have a governance way of attacking it, it won't happen.
Yeah, definitely.
That's huge. Yeah.
And this ties back to the governance, right? Because if you have teams in place, you have the SRM teams and you have the VMOs that are governing this, that are governing supplier improvement and development. That is the only way that this can happen. So it's all really tying together, I feel, with the roles and responsibilities that we defined in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that in practice where, people are like, well, we're not getting any innovation. What they have is operational to operational day-to-day people working together. And that's great. Things are running well on a day-to-day basis, but those aren't the people who are going to be talking about the next improvements to drive this kind of innovative behavior. So it's really important that governance model takes this into consideration, like you said.
You see it on the next slide there, especially the IT group.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the next slide, now that we're talking about it, we see, so this slide really talks about when the involvement of strategic suppliers in the requirements definition phase in the sourcing process. So Michael was just talking about the IT point. 82% of Pinnacles have IT in the IT category are getting strategic supplier involvement at an early stage. And that really says something, right? Because if your suppliers are involved in an early stage of the process, then that means that they're able to actually influence decision making. And that's the only way that they can go on to become a strategic partner in an overall run. So again, indirect spend is also higher than direct spend, again, which is happening over here. And IT is relatively higher as compared to the other categories. I just noticed that it's interesting to see that BPO is also on top. So IT and BPO also had relatively better governance when we tie back to the governance aspect. So yeah.
Well, Banushi, this is another slide where, like the one that Amy was talking about, the technology. This is another one where, you know, even the Pinnacle enterprises, their inclusion of innovation is still relatively low. I mean, if you look at the direct spend, nothing over 30-something%, and look at the indirect, it's still, you know, most of them are below 50.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, I've tried to do this on the direct side. It's hard to get supplier input into your product. It's not hard to get supplier input. It's hard to accept supplier input into your direct products, right? Or your parts. You know, there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, Michael, I think of when our consulting teams work with IT or BPO projects, and they don't do a traditional straight RFP. They go out and they do these, you know, partnership kind of meetings with the providers to try to solutioning meetings, I should call them, with the providers to try to develop the right solution for the goals that the business has, right? Yes. That's exactly the kind of involvement that we're talking here. You're defining what the specifications and the requirements are jointly. And the reason they do that is because they've seen much stronger outcomes from that process versus saying, here's the list of what we need, tell us how much it's going to cost. And then traditional, you know, I know an RFP has a little bit of proposal aspects, but they're still pretty well defined. And that's something that, you know, I think is really a differentiator here.
Yeah, and I think you can map that directly back to how procurement sees itself, or how the organization sees procurement and its role in the overall organization. So, all right, fantastic. This has been great. In my mind, you've convinced me that there is a cause and effect relationship. There are enterprises out there that are driving value through the strategic supplier management. So there's no question in my mind. I'm totally bought into it. So we're going to do a series of Q&A, but before we do that, I want to give you a special offer. And so what we find is that when we talk to people and we show them a slice of our data, we get more questions and more opportunities to have conversations. So what we're going to do here is open up a quick poll for you, opportunity for enterprises, those that buy services, to offer up a slice of our data or our conversation with Amy and Banushi and the rest of the team. And if you're interested in that, go ahead and click the button there. If these are something that you'd like to have a conversation or want more an additional information on in a conversation, that's great. We'll leave it open for another 10 seconds here or so.
Yeah, and let me clarify. If you're currently a member of our outsourcing excellence program, you don't need to click this. You already have these, and you can just shoot us an email and have a conversation about these reports anytime. That is one benefit of being a member of our programs, that you get all this access to the research, but also access to the analysts unlimited. So. But these are some great reports here that our various teams have put together. So we're always happy to share and add some voiceover and narrative to contextualize it for you.
Yeah, so we can talk about different service providers, different locations, and different markets. So I think it gives a fairly robust view of any of these topics. So, okay, all right, let's close that off and let's open it up to Q&A. And I know that there are a number of questions, and I'm gonna address one of them with a statement, and then we'll answer the question. I think, Amy, you had a perspective on this one. So what type of organizations make up the sample set? So this is our target is a global 1,000. So there are no small or small and mid-sized organizations in this. It's largely going to be multi-billion-dollar companies here. But the question was, is there a bias toward a specific industry that are making it into the Pinnacle?
Yeah, so looking at the data that we got this time around, we had a pretty geographic, well distributed geographic distribution. So we had a lot of companies from the Asia Pacific or India region. We had a good amount of European, as well as always a lot of North American companies. I wouldn't say that there was an industry that stood out. I'd say that typically what you see with these kind of activities is that larger organizations have a bit of an advantage. They may have a more mature procurement organization. They may have more resources to put into this. They may have started earlier at building an SRM program and have more focused activities. So I'd say there's always a little bit of a company size bias in these things, but I didn't see an industry bias this time around.
All right, here's another question. What are your thoughts on sharing forecasting plans with suppliers as part of a supplier management platform?
That one just came in. Sharing forecasting plans with suppliers. Yes, I would say that, if you're talking about more from the tactical point of view, that's kind of the sales and operations planning concept, incredibly important and shown to be very effective. When you're talking more long-term, I think that if there's strategic partners that you're looking to work with on a longer term basis, then there's benefits to both of you to share those kind of plans. Do they have the capacity? What decisions do they need to make to be able to support the changes in your business? And I think that as long as you have the right terms and NDAs in place, there's not much harm and there's a lot of benefit that comes from forecasting sharing.
Here's another question here. Where there are truly strategic partners, if you're switching them out annually or based on single factor triggers. So
I was hoping you'd ask that, because I guess I want to clarify a little on that question. We're just asking, are you reevaluating and looking at the whole list on a regular basis? You could be adding and you could be removing suppliers based on changes to the business or changes to the suppliers themselves. I would not anticipate that being, we're going to change the entire list every year or even a significant amount. But if you're, these days, like, I think our businesses are all volatile enough in various ways that, going a couple of years without examining, is there any shift in our supply base and what our needs are, you're kind of driving blind. So I agree, though, that if you're switching your, 50% of your strategic supplier list every year, you're probably not really strategic.
No, and in many places, that's not even feasible for most businesses. You can't switch out that much. That would
you're not even switching, but who you consider strategic. Like, your governance plan should not be that volatile at all.
But it's like anything. What's the old saying that if you measure, if you want results, you got to measure it. And I think that same thing applies here. So if you want to have a review and then ask the dimensions, are you making the things happen that need to happen? I think that just asking the questions and having the review process will make a lot of change.
Yeah, I agree.
So, all right, we're going to wrap right now. And Amy, I know you want to just kind of do one little commercial here on the next slide, just kind of tells people what we do, and if they want to engage with you more and your team. Why don't you just do a quick commercial?
Yeah. And I know there's a bunch of questions we didn't get to. We never do. I'm happy to see so much involvement and engagement. I'll go through those, and some of them we can shoot an email out with an answer. And if you want to have a conversation with our analysts, happy to do that. We're kind of on the enterprise side, so if you're a service provider, there are different analysts who can have that conversation, but we're really focused on the procurement team right now, and IT teams, other buying teams that implement these kinds of programs. So enterprise, in terms of how we work with enterprises and specifically with procurement teams, there's really two programs that we have in our sourcing and vendor management program. One is focused on getting you the market intelligence to maximize value from your portfolio and your solution design. And the other is focused on price benchmarking and pricing analytics, cost, performance, contract terms, and really the financial and the commercial terms with your providers. For those of you less familiar with Everest Group, we are completely focused on global services. So typically for procurement teams, that's your categories of technology and operations, outsourcing, engineering services, BPO, things like that. One other thing on the next slide that we've put in place is capabilities around category management. So we have thousands of reports. If you go and play around in the complementary part of our portal, you'll see more information than you could digest in probably a year of reading. But for category manager specifically, we realized there's certain terms that you want to pull out and aspects you want to pull out of those reports. So we put together templates for all of the most popular categories. We're rolling these out through the course of the year. Credit to Banushi, who's really piloted this. I should let her talk about it, or driven this activity. But these go through a lot of the common frameworks or things that you may need, like a SWOT analysis or TCO structure, or the top 6 trends in a category in a PowerPoint format that you can take out and share with your internal stakeholders. We also have a guide for developing category strategies. That's one of the options in that that offer that Michael made earlier, was to have a copy of that guide. If you didn't click that and you want to come back after and talk to us about that, happy to have that conversation as well. If you can't tell, I kind of like talking to procurement people about this stuff. So feel free to reach out with any of the offers here, and we're happy to talk through, questions, things like that. So.
All right. Amy, Banushi, I'm convinced. Fantastic conversation. And if there's anything we can do to help, reach out to us. And with that, we'll conclude. And thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you to Michael, Amy, and Banushi. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 or 2 business days with a link to download to the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.